Hello and welcome, you curious souls that dared to dream. Here is today's inspired message. Today, I'm here to talk about the topic of our shame of depression. To talk about the discussion between a mental health crisis versus a spiritual awakening opportunity. We have become lost in our interpretation of our egoic interpretation of our emotions, or more precisely, our negative emotions in the form of depression, anxiety, despair, self loathing, to name but a few. But there is real hidden treasure beneath these uncomfortable experiences, but which comes from a spiritual perspective. Only a spiritual perspective, a perspective that has a more broad understanding, that steps back from the initial stimulus of the pain. So the egoic perspective is narrow. It experiences the emotion, the negative emotion, for example, depression, anxiety, and it defines it as bad, which then leads to the definition of mental health crisis, which then leads to the action of going to a doctor to be prescribed medication, antidepressant medication. Anti, which means you're combating it, which means you're ashamed of your emotion, or you're ashamed of that emotion, and you're actively taking a medication, taking drugs, because it is a drug, to combat your emotions or a specific set of your emotions. Because the ego, because too many have accepted the casual definition that we are in, that society is in, a mental health crisis. That mental health crisis has occurred because we've fed this egoic idea that depression, anxiety, etc. are bad, and happiness, joy are good. So we have a good and bad. We have a celebrated and a shamed set of emotions. And this has led to a narrow perspective rather than the opposing view, which is a spiritual view, which is broad, which sees things holistically. It sees the pain. It hurts, don't get me wrong. The spiritual perspective isn't naive to the suffering, but it sees suffering as something which is tied to something else, which is tied to an opportunity, which is a sort of, well, we call it, it can be called a spiritual awakening, but it can be understood, the depression, the anxiety can be understood as a form of messaging to a hidden part of your psychology that you can't otherwise, in your busy life, become aware of. And so, because you're not aware of it, you can't deal with it. So over an extended period of time, it then forms into depression, because it's ultimately built up these unresolved emotions that you've not been conscious of because your life is busy and you've been preoccupied. Gets to a point where it becomes overwhelming and it spills over, and you get unbearable depression or anxiety, and then you think it's bad, i.e., I need to combat it with antidepressants. Anti-depression. Depression is something you are experiencing. It is an expression of you. So you're anti yourself. When your family members are sad, you're not anti, for example, your mum. If your mum is crying, you're not anti mum in that moment. You nurture her, you take care of her, you listen to her, you help her. The same applies to you. When you're depressed or anxious and you're crying and you're breaking down, by taking antidepressants, you're effectively saying in that moment, shaming yourself. You're doing it materially, but more importantly, you're doing it metaphysically. You're sending a signal which is saying, I am not worthy of these emotions. I'm anti them, i.e. anti you. And in your most vulnerable moment, instead of tending to your emotion, you shame it. You outsource your responsibility to a doctor that has no interest in your spiritual process, merely the surface problem. And you can take antidepressants, and maybe there's a place for it in certain moments of crisis, because life can get pretty tough. So maybe there's a place, if you're really in an emergency. But long term, it's not. It's not in the spirit. If you're serious about your spiritual responsibility, or just your responsibility to yourself, because ultimately you can take antidepressants, but it's a short-term solution. Your emotional body isn't going to, it numbs the pain. It's the equivalent of putting earplugs in at a concert. Yes, you may dull the sound, but the concert's going to play on. Like, your emotions are screaming at you in those moments of intense depression or anxiety. They're screaming for your attention. And yeah, you can take antidepressants, and you can quieten the emotional essence in that moment, but ultimately the emotions are still your emotional body is still going to exercise its expression to attract your attention to the root cause, because remember, it's spilling over in that moment. So it's reached the surface of your attention, i.e. your conscious mind, but its root cause lies in your unconscious state, in the depth of your emotional body. So it's calling your attention. And obviously antidepressants are attractive because of their efficacy and because of their simplicity. It's a very complex problem that's been built up over many years and require many more years to engage with, to put order in, to establish order within that chaotic state. And so antidepressants, it's like you can easily, in that moment, for a short period, dull the pain, and you can rid yourself of that responsibility, and you can embrace your more prioritized, your more egoic prioritized concerns, because obviously your ego isn't too concerned with sacrificing its agenda for, let's say, validation in the form of money, career, relationships, for an emotion, to spend years into your inquiring, introspecting into your emotional body, and looking back in order to invest in the future, and ultimately you're investing time and energy into an immaterial domain, whereas your ego is looking to attract a body of wealth in the external domain. So there's going to be that tension, and it will ultimately be up to you how you define it, whether you define it as a mental health crisis, or whether you define it as an opportunity to embody a spiritual awakening opportunity. And this obviously manifest in either taking antidepressants, in the form of falling into a dualistic dimension, such as good and bad. Doesn't leave a lot of room for nuance, doesn't leave a lot of room for exploration. I mean, if you're experiencing your life solely through good and bad, there's not much fun there. It's pretty lackluster. I mean, if we go through our entire lives as just good and bad, I mean, where's the fun? I mean, there's a plethora of potential in every single moment, and we have the opportunity to dive into those, because there is countless layers of wisdom and knowledge and understanding in every moment, in every emotion, in every thought, in every idea, in every prospect, in every person. But if we just egoically, with a narrow lens, perceive it as good or bad and just boop, because ultimately we do that because it's easy, because we want to focus more our attention on material ambitions, egoic ambitions. You know, I want more validation. I want to be loved more by other people. I want more money. I want more success. And there's a place for material endeavors. Of course, there's a balance to be had here, but the purpose of this video is to bring some attention to the opposing side, the more spiritual, the more broad perspective, the perspective that aims to dig deeper into prospects that you experience in your inner and outer existence, because there are countless layers that if you dig deep into, you will find a lot of opportunity that will yield unexpected results. So I would advise you, the curious soul that dared to dream, to peel back the layers of your inner outer existence. But for the example of this video, in terms of your emotions, in the example of depression, anxiety, despair, self-loathing, unworthiness, these emotions that cause you to take antidepressants, that cause you to seek a doctor, that cause you to dismiss these emotions. Understand that they are there to help you, not to hinder you. And yes, in the moment, in the present, in the short term, of course, they are going to hinder your egoic narrative, your egoic pursuits. And if you are serious about balancing your material with your spiritual, then you're going to have to sacrifice some of your, at least in the short term, some of your material egoic agenda to tend to a spiritual endeavor. So with that, I'll leave it with you in your capable hands. Good luck.